Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming tonight. We're just going to wait for everyone to trickle in, give it a couple of minutes, and then we'll begin.
Hello, everybody. I think that's everybody in the room, as it were. So welcome. Just to briefly introduce myself, my name's David Gilbert. I'm Director at Block Projects. Thank you for joining us this evening. It's lovely to have you with us. My pronouns are he and him. I'm a white male in my late 50s. I won't specify how late. I'm just going to cover a little bit of housekeeping and also say how delighted we are to have Désirée and Eelyn with us. This also, I should add, coincides quite neatly with Désirée's commission for the Block billboard, which we had planned to put up today, but due to the latest storm and Eunice as well, we thought it best to hold off until the wind has died down for two reasons. Firstly, because it's really difficult to put up when it's raining. And secondly, because there's a pretty good chance of it blowing away down the street and the billboard disappearing without trace. So we're planning to have Désirée's billboard up probably on Monday of next week. So look out for that. So just to briefly cover some housekeeping, if everybody wouldn't mind keeping your camera and microphone turned off during the session, we're recording it. So it's great just to record the speakers and the BSL interpreters who are with us this evening. Thanks to Max and Vicky who are with us this evening. Thanks also to our two volunteers, Hattie and Krupa, who are helping us with the technical aspects of tonight's event. If you'd like to comment or ask questions, it'd be great if you could just pop those into the chat as we go along. We will have a break about halfway through this evening's session. So we'll be having a look in the chat to see what kind of questions and comments there are there, and we'll hopefully pick those up either when we come back after the break or towards the end of the session. So we'll try to cover as many of those as we can. We also would love it if you were able to fill out a feedback form for us. That'll be a Google form, which the link for will be in the chat towards the end of the session as well. Feedback's really, really useful. It helps us to justify our existence to our funders, for example, but also it's really useful for us to have your critical feedback on the sessions that we're running and how we can improve them. So it would be tremendous to have your feedback if you could fill that in for us towards the end. So that's enough chat from me. I'll hand you over to the interesting part of the evening, which Sunshine is going to introduce to you.
Thanks, David. Oh, that was no less interesting. All the housekeeping is very important, and the acknowledgement as well of our signers and our tech support. So thank you, Max, Vicky, Krupa, and Hattie for joining us too. So hi, everyone. I'm Sunshine. I'm the curator at Block Projects. Welcome to tonight's Harsh Light. So as you may or may not know, Harsh Light is a webinar series that we've been holding since 2020 when COVID hit. And it started off as a place where we could come together as art workers to kind of see how we're doing, ask the questions that we've been asking one another in terms of how we're surviving, whether we're doing okay, how we're keeping our practices afloat. But it was also coinciding with a new strategy that Arts Council England had put out about investment principles and the ways that they're going to fund arts moving forward in the next 10 years. So this was also a place for us to kind of think through some of those things. Not least, there were also lots of social and political upheavals the last couple of years, and we have also been looking into that as well in relation to our work, in relation to how we're trying to build a practice. So all of these things come together under Harsh Light, and we try to make this a critical yet informal and restorative space for everyone to come together and work through all these different questions. And so tonight we're really, really stoked, really happy to have Désirée and Eelyn with us. Désirée Reynolds is a writer. Eelyn Lee is an artist and filmmaker. I'll let them introduce themselves later as well a little bit. But I generally like to start these webinars with a very quick kind of somatic grounding exercise, you can call it, of 2 or 3 minutes. You're more than welcome to opt out if this is not your thing, but if you join in, then that would be great. I just find that, especially in the middle of the week and it's the end of the day, it's quite helpful for all of us to settle whatever we've been dealing with in the day, and just try and create a bit of a room, because we're also kind of in our separate little spaces. And it's just, yeah, a way to kind of keep the temperature even, I suppose, for all of us. So if you want to join me, we're going to do a quick kind of stretch and a little breathing exercise. So the stretching exercise, very simple. And by the way, if you want to turn off your video speakers or BSL interpreters, oh, not BSL interpreters, you need to stay on. But if you want to turn off your video speakers, you're welcome to, so that you can stretch in private, but otherwise you're welcome to keep them on. So the simple stretch exercise will be for the neck tonight, primarily. So we're just going to tilt our head to one side. We're just going to keep it there for a good 20 seconds. And using this time, you can either close your eyes or soften your gaze and just look at something quite neutral, I suppose, in the room, and just notice your eyes no longer focusing really hard on whatever it is, allowing your eyebrows to kind of separate and kind of go towards your ears, releasing the tension between them. Gonna tilt our head the other side now, just leaving it there. Breathe normally, you don't have to take deep breaths. You can close your eyes or just look quite softly at whatever in the room. Okay, so bringing our heads back to the middle. One hand on your chest and one hand on your abdomen. A quick 3 or 4 deep breaths. Let's do 4 deep breaths. That's nice to have round, even number. So in and out through your nose, and try and really breathe into your abdomen and let your breath sit there for 4 breaths. So I'll count us in and out. In, 2, 3, 4, out. Through your nose as well. 2, 3, 4. And then in again. 2, 3, 4, and out. 2, 3, 4. In, 2, 3, 4. Out. 2, 3, 4. Last one. In, 2, 3, 4, and out. 2, 3, 4. Okay. Thank you. So I'm going to introduce Eelyn and Désirée. Actually, Eelyn, Désirée, I could read your bios. I didn't ask you this, so this is a little bit on the fly, but would you like to introduce yourselves? Would you like to maybe tell our attendees a little bit about yourselves that's outside of the bios, or yeah, just tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing. Maybe Désirée can start first.
Oh, this is one of those things about being online. I was like, don't pick me, don't pick me. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm a little bit of an open book, unfortunately. So in terms of what I've been doing recently, I think most people might have come across it in one form or another in terms of the Dig Where You Stand movement and collective it's growing exponentially as we speak, which is part of me being a writer in residence at the Sheffield City Archives, uncovering unexplored marginalised stories. So this is why this fits in with this Harsh Light so well, thinking about the archives. What do we mean about archiving? What do we mean by the power of the archives, the silences of the archives? And that's what I've been concerned with recently. I tend to gibber when I get to have to introduce myself, so I'll just quickly say,
you know.
Well, also my mom is here, so no swearing, and everyone behave yourselves, but just that she's a huge and massive influence of mine, and I managed to get a little recording of her, which is part of the prose poem that I wrote for this piece that's coming up on Block next week. But the soundscape is already on the website.
It is. Yes, thank you. Thanks so much, Désirée. How about you, Eelyn? You've got a bit of a throat infection, so I'll also let people know to, so that they're ready. They understand where you're coming from as well. And so yeah, Eelyn, go ahead.
Thanks, Sunshine. Yeah, that's where I am tonight. Yeah, I just got an old school cold. Obviously, I kept taking COVID tests, but yeah, got a cold, which is all here. So excuse me if I get a bit raspy. So I'm an artist and filmmaker based in Sheffield. I've been here now, gosh, about 7 years. Before that, I was based in London, primarily in East London. And for over 20 years, my practice has been very much sort of based in the socially engaged realm, if you like. So in London, I was very much embedded in communities in East London and South East London, particularly working with young people. I've made a lot of films in collaboration with young people. And then as I shifted my life and practice to Sheffield, I've done a few sort of different collaborative film projects with young people, including a project with Sheffield College, art students from Sheffield College, where we collectively research the landscape on the edges of the city, where derelict Victorian cemetery meets the River Don. That was really good fun. And that culminated in an exhibition and a film that was presented at Site Gallery. And I also in 2018-19 made sees me and a group of young writers from Sheffield go on a quest to find out the meaning of Britishness. And we explore the notion of race, nation identity through the lens of race, migration and belonging. And that's actually how Désirée and I first started to work together. So in this first half of the conversation, we were actually going to talk about friendship as well as practice. And maybe that is a good enough place as any to start, because I invited Désirée to work with me on Britishness, and from there, we started sort of collaborating in terms of art projects, but then also we became very good friends. So in 3 years, our friendship has kind of blossomed, if you like, during a time of complete global craziness. So if you think 2019 to 2021. There wasn't no accident that we were exploring the idea of Britishness when we'd just come out of the EU. There's the rise of the far right across the world, and then the pandemic hit, and then George Floyd was publicly murdered, and then the BLM movement had an upsurge, and then there was a global reckoning on race. And in the whole context of the pandemic, there was also a whole upsurge in Asian hate. So Désirée and I were quite keen to talk about how our practices have shifted as well during this period. So
yeah, that's also a good way to kind of set the scene for our attendees as well, because we, like David said, we're going to have a little break in between. So as Eelyn said in this first part, she and Désirée will be kind of focusing on kind of providing some of the context behind their friendship, their collaboration, and where their overlaps are in their, I would say, storytelling practices. So, and then we'll take a little break. And then when we come back in the second half, we'll delve deeper into archives, renarration, Désirée's experience working with Sheffield Archives, but also more generally that their redefining of archives, because the way Eelyn is working in her current project and in her current practice more broadly, actually considers archives as a very sort of embodied, activated kind of thing, rather than a static space or place that you go and visit and look at documents. So on that note, I'm just going to take my video out and leave the space to Eelyn and to Désirée, and I will pop back up again briefly right before I announce that we have to go on a break. So I'll give the space over to Eelyn and to Désirée. We'll see you later.
What? What? See you later.
Oh, on that note, if you have your audio on or if you have your videos on, can you make sure that you turn them off, because we're going to be, we're recording this. So thank you.
thanks, Sunshine. So I think I got a little bit ahead of myself, talking a little bit how we met, Désirée, and worked together first on Britishness. So I don't know, maybe you want to say a little bit about your role in Britishness, which obviously became quite pivotal to the film as well.
I think, it feels like a long time ago, doesn't it? So as many of you who are practicing artists in one way or another, and you very often get these, hopefully, not often necessarily, get these commissions that kind of lay out what they would like you to uncover, discover, and think about. And actually, when Eelyn talked to me about this film, it was like, okay, wait, you know, the idea of talking about Britishness, for me, and for Eelyn as well, I guess we couldn't talk about Britishness unless we talked about the problems that is inherent with thinking and talking about Britishness. So it couldn't be a straightforward, this is Britishness, without uncovering colonial legacies, or without thinking about those violences, without thinking about our positionality within those different discourses. So we kind of came together on that, didn't we, when we were thinking about, well, actually, Eelyn approached me and said, you know, I've been teaching for a while, delivering workshops on creative writing, and she said, well, would you be willing to think about, would you be willing to be a part of the film and to think about this Britishness in this way? And so that's how we met. And Eelyn's very much like, they're interesting, I'm going to talk to them. Whereas I might be, oh no, I can't talk to them. She's kind of quite forward in that way, whereas I'm kind of quite shy and reticent. She's like, that's what I'm doing. I love that person, I'm going to go and talk to them. And I love that about her. So we came together on discussing Britishness and with our respective identities and what that means to both of us, and the differences and the similarities and all of that. So that's how we met, and we've continued on that vein. I think it's safe to say, for some reason, who we are and what we choose to make and what we choose and how we choose to practice involves our identities. It's wrapped up with our identities quite fiercely, even though sometimes it may come at odds with whoever might be funding us, or whatever story we choose to do. I think one of the things that I think embodies that is that we both choose to speak story to power. That's at the heart of what we want to do. and what we continue to try to do.
Yeah, that's true. And then we also, we brought together to have conversations and to collaborate over, themes of race and identity. So, and I guess, we've both been having those conversations, throughout our whole lives for quite a few decades now. So when everything kind of like the whole reckoning on race happened, after the murder of George Floyd, some of those conversations that emerged seemed quite familiar, but they were also happening in different ways as well. So it was quite interesting to revisit some old themes, but within the context of new discourse. And then I hunted you down, didn't I, to collaborate on Born on Sunday Silent. So Désirée had written this amazing short story, which was in the Book of Sheffield, which is a collection of short stories. All I don't know if they're all actually set in Sheffield, but they're all like authors with a link to Sheffield. Are they all set in Sheffield?
Yeah, because it's the Book of Sheffield, so they they are all set in Sheffield in various different times, different ways. Johnny Pitts is in there, Margaret Drabble is in there, a whole host of different writers connected to Sheffield, edited by Catherine Taylor, and published by Comma Press. So one of the things that started me off on these, oh, thank you, Hattie, putting it in the chat there. There's the link. Thank you. One of the things, one of the things that I loved about, well, first of all, I think I should mention, like I said, my mom's listening, and she would take us, she has done, she's going to say she didn't, but I remember her taking me to she loves graveyards. She always has loved graveyards, and we would walk in there's a graveyard quite close to our old house in London, and we would walk through graveyards and look at the names and look at the dates, and she finds all that thing fascinating. So it wasn't really a place that was scary for me. It was a place that was really about information. My mum talking about, well, how long ago was that when that person passed away, and what does that mean? We always did it, and I never found it unusual until I realized that some people don't actually do that at all. So I lived in Stalkerleys Road, if any of you know Sheffield, which is not far from, it's literally up the road from Sheffield General Cemetery. I got the commission from Comma Press to write this short story called, which I call Born on Sunday Silent, thinking about a story that I found in the cemetery of Kai Kusyamansa, who she was in the stomach of her mother at the time. She was born here in Sheffield. Her parents were part of an Ashanti village that was brought here in 1902 as a form of entertainment. Now, we can't know about the power relationships that will or wouldn't have taken place, but she was born here, she died here, she was only 4 days old when she died here, and it just resonated with me that whole story is really about power, again, about colonialities, and what it would mean to be buried somewhere far away from home. I myself, I've been in Sheffield for a very long time, over 20 years, but I still feel like London is also my home. Came up here as a student. What does that feel to be disconnected from the place that you're in? And then thinking about diaspora, because that also is another form of disconnection, which Eelyn and I both share. And that kind of opened the door to this in a strange way, because then Eelyn, you came and said, have you thought about making that short story into a film?
Yeah, absolutely. I thought I heard you, I think, read an extract from it at the book launch, which was in the pub on Sheffield train station, which was a great location. And I just thought it was like an amazing really kind of layered piece of work, because it has, you know, it has the story of you searching for these kind of like the hidden story of Kai, but it also has a little sort of glimpses of the story of Kai and the Ashanti village. So I really love the way you kind of interwove those narratives, which are very much about the past and the present, and the way you are kind of like haunted by Kai, really, in her absence, but her presence at the same time. And I've been doing quite a lot of work around hauntings, and I've been doing a whole body of work around Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and looking at the idea of othering, basically, the fact that we, you know, create our own monsters from fear or the need to boost ego in terms, and power dynamics in terms of creating somebody as other. So I mean, lots of people have written about that in different ways, whether it's Spivak or James Baldwin. So not a new thought, but and I think it comes out in stories and storytelling, in literature, in a whole number of ways. And I was exploring the story premise of a stranger comes to town, and then what happens when a stranger arrives, usually in a small town environment, and kind of starts to disrupt the status quo. And so when I read your short story, it kind of really resonated in a whole number of ways in terms of the things that I was exploring as well. And I thought it would make a perfect short film. So when I approached Désirée if she would be interested in like collaborating in co-writing in terms of adapting the story into a screenplay, she was like, no, I don't like collaborating. So so then, well, here we are 2 years later, and we're making the film this year.
Can't shake her. But I'm scared of collaborations, because I end up kind of you end up kind of having to work out who you are in a collaboration in a different way to being a self-obsessed writer, where you're just sat doing your own thing for hours and hours and weeks, and then like you have to kind of consider where does this fit in with what another person's idea is. And it's been a really fruitful collaboration for me, and I've learned quite a lot. But just going back to the idea of us and how we connected, also thinking about Born on Sunday, about rummaging around in a graveyard, and thinking about the archives, also thinking about what do we mean by horror, and we just happen to be working on this anyway at the same time, in a zeitgeisty kind of way, at the same time as culture looks at horror and what does horror mean, like Get Out, like Lovecraft Country, like Us, and that the horror is racism is the horror, as opposed to the idea of like zombies or Dracula. Dracula's my mom's favorite. Dracula, Frankenstein, all those embodied styles of all those embodied styles, things of horror, peoples of horror, but really what is the true horror? And as you just named James Baldwin, other people thinking about racism, thinking about imperialism, and what's that done to people of color across the world, and therein lies a true horror. So that's also another way that we connected as well.
Yeah, so this is the first time we've publicly spoken about Born on Sunday Silent, the film. So you heard it here first. And so yeah, through developing that, we did have quite a few conversations about where to situate the horror in the film, didn't we? So so the horror we thought about, you know, how does racism function in this country? Because, like, you know, Dee, you mentioned films like Get Out, Lovecraft Country, where very much, you know, racism and racialization is being discussed through horror genres and traditions, but how would that translate to a British context? So we talked about the structural racism that is in the institutions, and especially the old, colonial institutions that we still having to operate within and within their governance right now. So we decided to situate the horror in the institution of the library. So we're not going to tell you too much about it right now, but yeah, it's very exciting that we're going to be making the film this year, and it's very much a Sheffield story. And we like to think that it is, yeah, a time when we can kind of think about horror and racialization within a British context, which is kind of different to what's going on filmically in those genres, which is basically coming out of America, or basically coming out of Jordan Peele's production company.
There's his house as well, which
there is his house, yeah.
And so Hattie's put in the YouTube Born on Sunday silent film, which is like a kind of poetic piece that I made quickly over the pandemic, because I was commissioned by the library to make that, because it was right at the height of the pandemic and we wanted a way to share the story. So that's what that link is. But also what Eelyn's talking about is something bigger. Bigger, but we can't quite say just yet, I think. Is that what you're saying, Eelyn? Because I'm busting to say, but okay, we won't do that. Please ask us some questions. If we've said something that you want us to kind of just explore a bit more, we're more than happy to do that. If you want us to repeat and say, what is it? Get us to explain what we've said, please do, it's fine. Sunshine has asked, why the library? Why is it set in the library? Well, the short story is really about how we come to terms with those silences in the library, in the archives, in the ways in which we're trying to explore a history that's been predominantly hidden. And I think I need to say sort of hidden on purpose. It's not an accident. So in the story, I go looking for Kai, and as I did do when I was commissioned to write the short story. So I went looking for people of color in that cemetery, in the archives, and found that there wasn't anything that was immediate. There wasn't anything that was completely open and out there. I had to really dig, and even the librarians were frustrated. I'd say, have you got anything about Sheffield's connection to the transatlantic slave trade? And they'd show me a folder that was kind of that big, because they recognized that the work really hadn't been done, and the fact that work needed to be done, which is the frustrating thing. I say in one of my pieces, the idea of history is dependent upon funding. So the library becomes a site of struggle, really. What isn't in the library is the important thing. That's what we're trying to discuss. What isn't there, what isn't in the archive is also a similar thing. Would you say so, Eelyn?
Yeah, absolutely. And then we decided to locate the horror in the library, because that's where the horror of racism kind of lies in this country, is like the absence of stories, and particularly stories around Britain's colonial past. So we have, we basically in our film kind of like, we go on a journey, and where we go beyond the walls of the library, and we find out Kai's hidden story, but through busting through the walls, and then you find out this whole other is a kind of like a bit of a time travel film, if you like, but you can actually travel through time through kind of like breaking through the portal of the bookshelves.
Mute myself before I start speaking. So Annie has said, could you please speak a little bit on racism as horror? And Yen is quite quite brilliantly pointed out, the Stanley's Fourth Diary. Thank you for that. That's exactly what we're talking about. So speak a little bit about racism as horror. So there's an absolutely fantastic academic based in Sheffield at the minute called Maisha Wester, who is at Sheffield University. She's not at Hallam, is she? I think she's at Sheffield University, and part of her remit is to discuss horror and the forms in which it takes in terms of the Black body and racism and colonialities. So I'm not sure, I mentioned her because we're talking to her about what we're trying to do with the film. But the idea that my mom was never, I've also just written this another piece, but my mom was never, my mom was a nurse when she came, and she was never scared of horror films, you know, like the Draculas and the Frankenstein and those things. Was I was terrified. I still am a little bit. But my mom was never scared of that. But she was scared of what could happen to us on the street. That was the real terror for her. What could happen to us if my brother got picked up by the police? That's the real horror. And for us and for many people, and you know, as it keeps being documented on social media. So that's what we mean by horror and racism. I don't know what the other thing that we have to look back and what was the other thing. Okay, Stanley's Fourth Diary, of course. So John Stanley's Fourth was born and raised in Sheffield, and moved to Liverpool as his interests and money grew. Are you Googling the year for me, Eelyn? Because I can't even remember now. But anyway, in Sheffield's archives is his diary. So this is a man, he's also got a picture. I hope maybe we can find it. He's got a portrait in the Portrait Gallery in London. He's a man who commissioned 79 ships on his own. That's what we know of, because potentially he could have very well commissioned more, but he commissioned in his lifetime 79 ships to go to the various countries of Africa as part of the transatlantic slave trade. And he's a Sheffielder born and bred. So the idea then is thinking about, I knew this already, and then suddenly I was given this little diary that's in the archives. I mean, if you ever saw it, it's like quite pretty, really. And in it doesn't say anything about how he makes his money. In the diary, it just says, oh, gone to see my family, had a drop of ruin, which is something that I find quite an incredible sentence, which was gin, I think. I'm sure somebody can tell me what ruin is. I think it's gin. And the fact is that the diary says nothing about how he made his fortune. And then we're probably going on to the second part here, but that is the silence is what we're talking about. It's what Yen was pointing out. The silence is the horror for all of us in this position in this country.
He mentions the weather a lot as well in his diary, doesn't he?
He really does. He really mentions the cold, the rain. He's visiting his mines. There's a bit of a controversy in one of his mines. They want to unionize or something. I know that Sunshine was saying about archives being, your approach to archives, Eelyn, is thinking about this living, breathing thing and what it means, instead of just sitting and looking through documents. But I kind of like sitting and looking through documents because of the things that you can find. And we talk about, I think about how things are categorized, really, which is about the archive as well, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, maybe you should talk a little bit about your residency, Désirée, in the archives, because Born on Sunday Silent, you write in that short story in 2019, I think, and then it's kind of led to quite a few different things, hasn't it? I mean, and then the residency in the archive, which then became Dig Where You Stand.
Yeah, so having found Kai, I believed quite strongly that perhaps Kai found me, really, as I was kind of rummaging around in the cemetery. And if those of you who aren't who don't live in Sheffield or aren't from Sheffield or don't know, Sheffield General Cemetery is actually beautiful. It's very beautifully maintained, isn't it? I don't want it to sound like it's this kind of other graveyards are different and maybe don't have as much upkeep, but Sheffield General Cemetery is very, very pretty. People get married there. It's very beautifully kept, and it's also a very important green space, isn't it? So it's preserved very well. Why did I mention that? Oh, so because of rooting around in the archives, even rooting around in the cemetery, and then finding Kai, and then thinking about, well, who else is there, and crucially, who else isn't there? For me, that's always at the heart of what I'm trying to do. Who isn't there? Who's not in the room? Who's not at the table? And who will never be there? So again, I then decided, I think I was on a call, a Zoom event, where there was a discussion now that we've, Eelyn was saying like a reckoning in terms of race in 2020. I'm not sure if reckoning is, I don't know, because it kind of feels like reckoning means that something has happened or something happens out of it. A conclusion comes from a reckoning, but I'm not sure that that's the case here, especially as we understand what's happening with culture at the minute. It seems to be working in the opposite. So I was on a call on a Zoom event, and the archives was there, and they said, oh, this is the stuff that we have. Again, this obligatory tiny folder with just pictures of those hose. Do you remember, Eelyn was like, if we ever see another picture of the hose being the metal instruments, because Sheffield made metal, that was sent off to the plantations, and that's the link. I mean, that's as important as any other links, but it felt a little bit like there's way more than this in here. So I said to the archives, you know what you need a writer in residence, because this isn't good enough. And they went, okay then. And then I was like, oh right, okay. Didn't expect them to say yes. And then a few months later, I'm kind of still there. I realized that what I had was bigger than me. I needed more artists to think about what is and isn't in the archives. And I wanted to make a piece of art as opposed to delivering a workshop, which I've done many, many times before, or to think about how we interpret the archives as individuals and also as communities as well. So I think that leads on to that, if that's answering the question. So now we have a movement, I like that word movement, called Dig Where You Stand, where we're looking about, I can tell you the influences of that. It was a few people actually, and Sadia Hartman, who is a favorite of me in Sunshine. We're on it, Sunshine, on it. Love her and her work. If you can put in like a link, Sunshine, to some of her books, that would be good for anybody who would like to check her out. And I read that such a long time ago, but obviously it was still in there years later. And also Sven Lindquist, who writes this teeny tiny powerful book called Exterminate All the Brutes, which is also thinking not just about archival material, but he's thinking about who he is and this information. And he writes like a crazy travelogue in Exterminate All the Brutes. I encourage anybody to read that. But one of the things he says in the book is we already have everything in the archive. There's already all the information is already there. We just don't have the courage to look at it properly and to place it where it needs to go. And I thought, okay, that's a really powerful statement, and I want to use that to frame whatever it is that we do next in terms of Dig Where You Stand. And I wanted to show that, and again, as Eelyn mentioned, I'm prattling on too much, but as Eelyn mentioned about us leaving Europe, what that has meant for communities of colour, for communities that are about activism, and what that has meant personally to us. Like, you know, I remember talking to people, older people, after the vote, and them feeling gutted and even more marginalised, and somehow that it was a very personal thing that Britain was telling them to leave, really, after the years of work and the years of service. So it was a particular time, really, Eelyn, wasn't it? I'm just aware of me going on and on and on. But anyway, so then we started the whole Dig Where You Stand movement, and watch this space for more to come.
I think, yeah, so maybe ending this first half on the Dig Where You Stand concept is quite a good starting point for after the break, isn't it? Because that whole notion of, like, literally dig where you'll stand, I think refers really quite nicely to, you know, our embodied archives and our knowledge is within. So, and to find that the truth is within us, and it can be quite empowering, actually, if we just kind of narrate our bodies and our histories into our own personal archives, and that can take many forms, which we'll explore after the break, I think. Sunshine, is that okay? Or...
You've done my job for me, Eelyn. A lovely summing up and a lovely sort of leading into this, to the second part as well. So thank you both so much. And yeah, we're definitely going to look into some of the questions that you've posed in the chat as well. But yeah, we'll come back in the second half, maybe kind of recap a few things that we talked about in the first bit, and look at some of the questions, and then also talk about Dig Where You Stand as, you know, the second part. I guess, yeah, the main question of the second part of the talk. So we'll come back at 8 o'clock sharp and continue then. So thanks, everyone. See you shortly. Hi, everyone. Yes, I'm on. I'm not muted. So we're back again, second half. I think we're going to have a conversation until about 20 past, and then give it like a 10-minute round up. Any sort of questions you might have in the chat, we'll try and answer those. But yeah, so Eelyn and Désirée ended on a really nice note of Dig Where You Stand as a project. Désirée's project obviously is named after this particular Sven Lindqvist quote. So we can start with that, but I wondered whether Eelyn or Désirée wanted to look at whether there were any particular questions in the chat you wanted to address right off, or whether you just wanted to weave them in. Yeah, any thoughts on that? Because there was a couple of questions there. One was quite nice from Anna Kime, which was about archiving. Oh, whether there was any active outreach from the archives that you know of, you know, so actively trying to acquire material or information from communities. And another one was from Udit. I have to scroll back up. Sorry, just one second. Horror of racism. What do you think? Horror racism in the British context lies ossified in rancid, awkward, and obsequious silences, making it convenient to normalize. What do you think this says about the way the socioeconomic fabric of humanity and human interactions has been contorted in the British context? That's quite a big question. We can kind of maybe, yeah, look at some of them, or we can just continue with the conversation as we had left it off.
Yeah, we can answer questions as we go along, or I don't mind whichever way we want to do it. Cool.
Yeah, I just wanted to give you the chance to answer something if there was something present. Yeah. If not, then you can just weave them in as you're talking about the archives. Which is that? Should we do that? Yeah. Okay, let's do that. I will leave you to it and be back at about 20 past.
Thanks. Sunshine. Oh, she's left us. So I think we were going to think about and discuss a bit about, you know, what the archive means to us, like individually and collaboratively, I guess, as well, Désirée. I mean, for me as well, something that's also that significant that happened during these pandemic years and all through last year, 2021, I was very much embroiled in a campaign to defund the CFCCA, which is the Contemporary Chinese Centre, the Centre for Chinese Contemporary Art, I'll never get it right, in Manchester, which basically has been going for about 30 years, but it's essentially run by white people. So 7 artists were commissioned. Yen Fongling was one of them. I think Yen's in the room as well tonight, to work with the organisation on a revisioning process, which would basically sort of address the issues of representation, their words, in the organisation. But basically, before the process had even hardly began, it was cancelled. So in one of the early meetings, the racism at the heart of the organisation at board level was exposed. And at that point, really, at that point was a starting point for a process. They decided to indefinitely pause the process and retreat into their boardroom. And so basically, because of our experiences, we wrote a very public report about the whole, you know, the whole process, every step of the way. And we had 5 calls to action, which basically to defund, for the Arts Council to defund the CFCCA. And if you go to, we've got an Instagram page called Artist Working Group. So Artist Working Group is the name given to us by CFCCA. So we started an Instagram page quite recently because we just thought for now it's just a place to archive some of the campaign, basically. So in preparation for this conversation, kind of, I think Sunshine, you mentioned it in terms of the work that I was embroiled in the activism work, if you like, to defund CFCCA, which I think actually has been successful because since the campaign, several board members stepped down, artistic director stepped down, the whole curatorial team stepped down, and they are now advertising for a new director. Whether that is the right way forward, whether that will just kind of repeat patterns of the past, only time will tell. But the advert has gone out for a second time now. So the first time they didn't recruit, they've since changed the job description to make it seem a bit more of a radical approach to changing the organisation. They had to report to the Arts Council in terms of what they were going to do to address some of the findings of our report and other people's testimonies. So I think to a large extent that the campaign did work. I mean, as you can imagine, being involved in something like that for a whole year is pretty exhausting. The saving grace was that there were 7 of us, so we were able to sort of like mutually support each other and share tasks. But the point I'm getting to is that basically, you know, that active activism was basically a fight, really, a fight to narrate our own stories, which is what an archive is. It's an active narration. And so, you know, CFCCA is kind of, for so long, it was okay. There's been a succession of white, mostly female, middle class directors. And in terms of that notion of Orientalism, it seems okay for white people to be telling those stories and framing cultures and histories of East Asian and Southeast Asian and Middle Eastern as well. I mean, if you think about Said's books, Orientalism and imperialism and culture, he talks in great detail about that. And so we started to think about the idea of activism as archiving and archiving as activism. So basically that particular example was, us fighting really to just reclaim and re-narrate our own stories from our own embodied perspectives. But where we're going now with that is potentially quite exciting, because now we're kind of like looking at how to collectivize as East and Southeast Asian artists, particularly working out of the UK and beyond, more broadly looking at diaspora, but thinking about, you know, how can we archive past, present and future, basically. So, and how can we, what are the ways, what are the methods of archiving? I was in an online session recently where we were talking about archiving, and somebody, I have to say, a white academic said, well, what's the, thinking they were being kind of devil's advocate, saying, well, what's the point in archiving? You know, surely by archiving, you are just repeating and echoing the institutions. But okay, that's a very privileged perspective to have, because it's basically those institutions have co-opted the notion of archiving. So humans have been archiving since time began, you know, whether that's through oral histories, song traditions, or writings on caves. You know, we all archive, but it's not, it doesn't have to be, you know, something that's like filed and categorized and put in a dark room. You know, arguably that is, you know, archiving from a certain perspective, which is most likely a structure of whiteness, which I think taps into Udit, your point that you mentioned in the chat before the break about sort of like how silence has been normalized within British culture. And so that's actually, you know, that normalization of the silence over decades, over centuries, has really sort of contorted and twisted our sense of identity and the way we interact, and the whole sort of like really structures that are the fabric of the society in this country. I mean, you know, literally the British government, if you like, have been controlling those narrations since the beginning of the British Empire, and controlling the narrations of other people's cultures. So going into a culture, into a country that is the other side of the world, and narrating themselves into that, the story of that place, and taking a kind of like a twisted, very simplified view of that place's culture as well, and managed to put themselves at the center of that story. And we are still living within that sort of, that mode of operating, really, because you kind of think about, you know, the Home Office's hostile environments. You know, they're still managing the narration of who is British. And you know, I'm going to stop in a minute. But for example, there's an article that recently came to light in The Guardian, which was only last year, about the deportation of Chinese merchant seamen in just after the Second World War. In 1946, about 20,000 Chinese merchant seamen came over here to work for the Allied forces during the Second World War, and they were based in Liverpool, and they were making really dangerous crossings across the Atlantic to get supplies, like food, basically, from America, bring it back to feed this country. A lot of them were killed by German U-boats, but then when the war ended, okay, a lot went back to China, Hong Kong, Singapore. But about 200 of those men had settled in this country, in Liverpool. And of course, like the notion of these Chinatowns, Chinese community had built up in Liverpool. And some had married English women or Irish women, and had kids. And then recently, because of the Freedom of Information Act, Home Office records have like come to light that basically there was an organized roundup and deportation of those, you know, approximately 200 men that wanted to stay here because they'd like put their roots down here and had families here. And there was a literal roundup, so they would go around homes, laundries, restaurants and whatnot, and like bundle these guys into boats, little boats that went off the coast of Liverpool onto a bigger boat, which had been converted with loads of bunk beds. And when there was enough beds filled, it set sail again to China, Hong Kong, and without a trace. It was all done in silence, and basically the women that were left behind and the kids, many of them just thought they had been just abandoned basically by the guys, by their partners, by the fathers. And it's only recently come to light of the truth in that, but it was actually, you know, a directive from the Home Office, Labour government at the time. And you think 1946, only 2 years later, Windrush arrives, and basically, you know, we're putting out the call for Commonwealth countries to come and rebuild this country. So on one hand, they're kind of like sending people home who have been, you know, helping feed the country during the war. And then 2 years later, they're inviting people back. And then, well, we know since know what's happened in terms of Windrush scandals since then as well. Sorry, I'm out.
Are you sure?
I don't know. I'm sorry, I went on a bit of a rant there. Yeah.
No, I thought it was very powerful and really interesting. I didn't think it was a rant at all, Eelyn. I think that it's a first of all, I thought the activism that you did with the Chinese contemporary arts, I thought it was fantastic. And I'm glad that you've mentioned it in this space, and it's a piece of work, and it was brilliantly done. And we'll see what happens out of it. But also that story about those men who were hauled out of their homes, and they were married, weren't they? I mean, it wasn't just, you know, that they were married with families, and they were sending their kids to school, and they were providing for them, and they got hauled up and rounded up and sent and deported, as you said. So I thought that's quite important. And again, because this is why the Dig Where You Stand, it's about excavating untold stories. This is the heart of what we're trying to do, and what Eelyn and I have come together, not just in our practices, but also within our families, within our communities, that we are concerned with. Again, where are the silences? This is something that people need to know, and it's something that we want them to know. It's very, thank you, Victoria, it's indeed very, very necessary. It is memory work, but it's also an act of reclaiming too, and again connected to where we are in terms of politics and race and gender in this country. It's a reclaiming of something that has been on purpose, very pointedly, being erased, and the government continues to do those erasures. And we only got to think about how the Mau Mau were treated, and how these colonial papers about how the Mau Mau were treated in Kenya were lost. Thousands of bits of paper lost. And it's the one thing that colonialism did very well, is documentation in all its horrendous, disgusting, horrific detail. Documentation is what they did. And suddenly, oh no, we can't find anything about the people they kept in prison, about the concentration camps that colonialism provided, which is something that is little known, is that during those times, imperialist colonial times, the methods of holding people, the concentration camp, started there, and then was perfected by various oppressive regimes. But it started during that time, which is documented in Sven Lindqvist's book, if anybody wants to check that out. So I think it's very important stuff, Eelyn. So I was listening, I was enthralled. I love hearing you talk about these things.
It was quite interesting, isn't it, what you're just saying about documentation? I mean, the bureaucracy of documentation. I mean, and then that where the power lies. I mean, if you invent a certain bureaucracy and ways of documenting, and then if that documentation is challenged, you kind of say, well, it's not in the documentation, so therefore it doesn't exist. It's this arrogance at its nth degree, but it's very conscious, isn't it, that's those people that kind of work within from those positions of power they know it works in terms of like maintaining and the power.
Yes, exactly. And going back to thinking about the institution of the archive, what does that mean? And I think I mentioned it before, when we're talking about how archives look now, the institutions of archives look now, it's these are sites of violence. These are sites of cultural violence, and this is what the silences are about. And this is what me and Eelyn are both really concerned with. And I think somebody mentioned something about how do archives engage with other communities, or are they kind of proactive about it? And we haven't got anybody from the archives here, but having been there for a few months, I'm not sure how other archives are conducted in other parts of the world, but here they have no money whatsoever. In terms of Sheffield's cultural institutions, where we're talking about massive, Sheffield museums, the galleries, the theatres, the archive have very little resources, and they get the kind of drag ends of what these other institutions may get. So sometimes an archive may not even know what's in there. They may not even know exactly, because I started going to the archives thinking it would be like, I was spoiled watching that program about the Victorian Albert Museum archiving, where every little thing is dotted and crossed and has its own little house, obviously because the archive goes in like how many floors underground, and it's funded to the high heavens. But actually, no, it's not like that. Kind of cities where the archives are thought of as basically not really thought of as an afterthought, is very huge gaps in there. And also thinking about interpretation of archives. How do people do it? And in what ways do we understand that to be? And that archives are very much dictated by fashion and trend and what people consider important at the time, which is why we come across those silences, which is why we come across those very hard bits of information, which I think always in an archive, when we come across people who are people of colour and women as well, and working class people, it's a collision with the archives. I found stuff where it's scraps of newspaper headings of people going to prison records, hospital records, and so then finding a name and piecing that story bit by bit and stitching it in all the different ways that I can, and then interpret that stitched bits of information. And for me, the only way to fill in those gaps was through creativity. Other people may think differently about that, and that's cool. But I felt like it can't necessarily stand as it is. So we needed to think about it in terms of not only what is not there, but also what can we do to put those things back in.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, there will always be gaps, won't there? Because it always depends on who's telling the story. But basically, the archives that we're dealing with right now, that there will always be gaps for minority and oppressed people. If you think about what would an archive of the oppressed look like, if you took it from that perspective. And I think Désirée, we've talked a lot about the idea of like living archives, and this kind of have like an archive should be in continual flux all the time. So it's continually narrated and re-narrated, and it's never still, it's never fixed.
Yes.
Because you will always, and it should be revisited and re-narrated from different perspectives, and in time and space. So as time moves on, we always need to revisit and re-narrate from different times, and in different geolocations as well.
Absolutely. And when we think about the origins of archiving in this country, when we think about, really, it's the same as the origins of the museums in this country, which was about going to someone else's country and taking anything that they thought that just belonged to them in an entitled way, and then their documentation, meaning a white male Western lens, then looks at this information, which is why we then have to go back and look at that information through our own lens, because we can't trust that it will be done in a way that is either respectful, with knowledge, and with some kind of emotional presence.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing that you started, that we now can't stop, Désirée, is the Dig Where You Stand movement in Sheffield and working with the archives. It's really exciting because you've got a few collaborators involved in the first iteration, a couple of poets, I think. And so now we're looking at kind of extending the project, and hopefully I can get involved later in the year and do some work around the East and Southeast Asian communities in Sheffield. But I think when we've talked about Dig Where You Stand becoming a movement that's kind of it's riffing off the Sven Lindqvist idea. But if we can actually make quite a noise in Sheffield, it could grow beyond Sheffield. But when we think about Sheffield, we are basically talking about re-narrating the city, because the narration around Sheffield for so long has been around the steel, white working classes and sort of socialist traditions, which are all very white. There are kind of white working class stories that are also written out of those narratives. But basically we're looking at ways to sort of build a fuller picture and find a new narration for the city.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's there. That's the thing about the archives, is that the material is all in there. It's about us going in, and the archives are open. This is the thing that I'm sure some people don't really realize, is that it's open and free, that you can just walk in there. Because I had some archives near my house, kind of archive stroke libraries, where you can just walk in and ask for things. Now with the pandemic, it's sometimes a little bit more tricky, but still the archives are an open space, and it's everyone's right to go and ask for something. And I think it's one of the few public facing things we still have, as the continued attack on libraries keeps going. It still is a place that someone can just literally walk in off the street and ask to see some stuff and be shown some stuff, because it's public record. It's meant to be owned by all of us. But yes, I'm just thinking about this question here about the public consultation about culture and the city centre. Wow, well, Anna, I don't know if we've got enough time for me to tell you about the city centre issues that I've had, and the ideas that I wanted to hopefully bring to the fore, and city centres and what they mean or what they don't mean. And Sheffield City Centre is a site of complete and utter struggle, and what it does and what it doesn't do. The fact that it's Meadow Hall and it's leached independent shops away from there, it's been closed. Anyway, it's very long. But in terms of the archives and what they do there, they have done lots and lots of work with consultation and work with not just other communities but other spaces. But again, I feel like it's not enough, and that we are, in terms of Dig Where You Stand, we're poised and ready to go in there and root through the stuff that they already have. I'm not sure if that answered your question actually, Anna, but anyway, the idea that that we can't kind of walk in there. I think institutions, especially like universities, you can't just walk in there, and the university archive is very exclusive compared to the libraries. But I do think that that we have to rethink what these institutions are doing, and that they shouldn't be there just for the sake of being there. They need to be working for us, including the archive.
Thank you so much, both of you, for such, so many amazing perspectives on archives. Thank you so much, everyone, too, in the chat. Oh my goodness, there's been so many contributions and amazing links and signpostings to the way archives and outreach might work together. I love this particular link to an article where they talk about memory work, liberatory memory work, really kind of thinking, I can really see that in relation to what Eelyn and Désirée are talking about with reclaiming and renarrating stories, and it just really kind of brings the work to the fore, the archive, the activism to the fore as well. I think the memory work, I suppose, is the key thing in there as well. There was a really good question I was hoping maybe we could spend the last couple of minutes on, which was about how this wonderful sort of excavation work might be incorporated into school curriculums, or just maybe even more broadly into lives, where you see the digging leading to more kind of practically, I suppose, in people's lives, and where they might encounter these knowledges. What do you think about that, Eelyn and Désirée?
It's a race to see who's going to unmute. You want to take that, Eelyn, or shall I start?
Well, I mean, it's a great idea, isn't it? And possibly like a really good way in for exploring the hidden histories, because there's such a stubborn refusal by the government to put the history of British colonial on the curriculum. So even though there's been an overwhelming support and call from families and young people that they want to learn about the history of British colonialism, the government still refused to put it on the curriculum. So maybe if we were more sneaky and saying, well, it's a curriculum about archiving and digging, maybe we can get it in that way.
I think being sneaky, we can always be sneaky, Eelyn. I mean, come on. This is my MO. I think that it is something that's probably going to happen, but perhaps maybe not in the way that we would like it to. But it's kind of an unstoppable change. And whilst these people being white institutions are kind of sort of gatekeeping what they think is important and not important, people are doing it anyway, and we can see that just by people. I think Anna also mentioned the rise in ancestry DNA sites where people want to know about these things. I mean, I do kind of think a little bit that people just want to know if they've got a king or queen in their background, or a notorious criminal or something interesting like that. But I find ordinary stories more interesting than kings and queens. I'm not a royalist whatsoever, but I think that these things are happening. Not just that, but I'm working with the University of Sheffield, and we're talking about a module. Even though the University of Sheffield is, any university at this point in time, it's not really about learning, it's about money. Controversial statement, but I don't care. It's about getting the money out of students rather than doing that kind of education work that it used to be when I went to college and before. So we are talking about modules with the university as a way of them accessing the archive as part, because it could be geography, it could be history, it could be sociology. I'm not quite sure why universities don't actually start there first, but they tend not to. So that's changing anyway in this part. But and breaking into schools is quite difficult. But I think once we get all of our resources and websites and more information, that I think we'll be able to go into schools, definitely.
Yeah, and maybe it's not just about trying to break into schools as one sort of like as a singular goal, or kind of trying to break into the mainstream sort of strands of knowledges and ways of doing things, but rather like finding sort of, as Sadia Hartman would probably say, these fugitive spaces as well, where you're able to broadcast and publicize these ways of thinking. I mean, the first time I met you, Désirée, we were at the Moore Market, where you had a stall there, you know, at a market. Like that's where conversations can happen. Those where people encounter things, especially in Moore Market. Like now, like I was really impressed that it was there, and the kinds of people that were walking by and checking out your research and looking through the few kind of like objects that you had kind of selected from the archives that they would otherwise, you know, be completely buried and never see the light of day. So yeah, there are places that are where it is already happening. So yeah, I am also aware of time, and I don't want to keep everyone here too long. So I'm just going to say thank you so much, Eelyn and Désirée, for your time. And thank you everyone, to all the attendees who've come tonight, and for the wonderful contributions in the chat. Anna had mentioned and asked earlier, rather, whether we can share the resources and the conversation that's happened concurrently in the chat. And I believe Hattie and Krupa are recording this conversation anyway. And I think in Zoom, you basically record the chat as soon as you record. So what I think will happen, what I think I can do, if everybody's happy with that, is that I can extract just the chat dialogue. And I have all of your emails, because you will have signed up to Eventbrite to come here tonight. And through the Eventbrite, I can email this chat back to you, if that's okay. Anybody who would prefer not to have this email, please just put it in, say so in the chat, DM me or whatever, that's fine as well. But otherwise, I will just email it out, and you can have it on record. So I hope that answers your question, Anna. And yeah, I think that's it. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Désirée. Thank you, Eelyn. If you could stay behind, please, the speakers and BSL interpreters, thank you as well, by the way, Max and Vicky. Hattie and Krupa, so many thank yous. Hattie and Krupa are tech support, who have been doing a great job tonight, relieving me of the stress of recording and facilitating at the same time. So yeah, please stay behind, and everybody else, good night, and we'll see you next time, hopefully. Bye.